suppose I need to find out more about
I'm trying to drink out of it.
what needs to be done. Yeah, I thought maybe you had an officer. If you don't have an officer, let me think through it and find out what the requirements are. Okay. All right. You have a good day.
The table that you put together was not really, I couldn't.
Who do you report to, Steve? Who do you report to? Steve Holland? She's my proper
You been there a while?
just a couple of years. He was one of the
The MVP. That's very interesting. Usually I thought it's the same thing that get printed on
Sounds like
both
at least you
sides.
have a relationship with the guy, right? What was his background? Oncologist?
Racial.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you put it in yesterday.
All right.
Mushroom group.
It says I have two connections.
Impressive place, man. I'll take my hat off.
We try.
It is impressive. The size of the place is still the way they maintain the quality. They develop thought leaders. They don't just buy them, but they do develop them.
We try.
Oh man, I'm just so always so. And the more I've learned about it, the more I've been.
It's a great place. Best movie of the life.
So I think it's 9 o'clock and I'd like to get started. Just want to welcome everybody back for the second half of the 2017 CDLT panel meeting. Yesterday we left off with code 8600X, and today I'd like to start with 86X7X. And what I'd like to do, as yesterday's routine, is to ask if the panel members have any questions for the presenters, any discussion amongst themselves, and is the panel to set their ballot for 86X7X. Ms. Davis, you have a question?
No, I'm just trying to get connected and I'm not.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead. Oh, Dr. Sutphin?
Could you summarize the recommendations?
Oh, okay, hold on. So I'm where Ms. Davis is. I'm trying to get organized. Sorry about that. So for 8687X, 86X7X, that's the Zika Virus Igm lab test. We have suggestions for crosswalks of 86536X1, excuse me, times 1, and another suggestion for 86790. And obviously, if the panel has other crosswalks they would like to consider, please put that on the ballot. Gap fill is also an option. And so go ahead and fill out your ballots. So while Glenn is collecting the ballots, I'm going to move on to the next code, which is from the microbiology section of the CPT AME manual. Excuse me.
Sorry, can you just pause a minute? We're having a little trouble finishing the first one.
Sure. Okay, Everybody ready? Okay. So the next code is 876XX from the microbiology section. The code is infectious agent detection by nucleic acid, DNA, or RNA, respiratory syncytial virus, amplified probe technique. And the crosswalks are the following. So for code 876XX, we have suggested crosswalks of 87801. And certainly, as you consider this, are there any questions for the presenters? Discussion amongst the panel? Okay, so I assume you would like to submit your ballots for 876XX, infectious agent detection by nucleic acid, DNA, or RNA, respiratory syncytial virus, amplified probe technique, with suggestions for a crosswalk of 87801. Certainly, you can also have other crosswalks in your ballot as well as gap fill. So while the ballots are being collected, we're going to move to the next code, 87X6X, also in microbiology. And this is the infectious agent detection by nucleic acid, DNA, or RNA, Zika virus, amplified probe technique. Crosswalks are 87502, 87798, and 87502. Okay, wait, let me start all over. 87501, 87502, and the last crosswalk that was suggested was 87798. So hold on a second. So we're doing some administrative housekeeping right now, so please bear with us. Should be 8653.
I see it.
It should be 8. I have 86536. Or 877. Who fills this out? No. Who had the transpose one?
I got it. In case you want to see it on video.
Okay, so we got to remember to come back to this. So we are going to come back to 86X7X. We need to speak with the panel about some of their crosswalks, but we're going to circle back to that one after we finish this list, okay? So we left off at 87X 876 87X6X, I'm sorry. Yes, 87X6X. No, go back one. And I apologize. So again, the crosswalks are 501, 87501, 87502, and 87798. Those are the three crosswalks. Does the panel want to speak to any of the presenters? Does the panel have any desire to discuss these crosswalks or other crosswalks amongst themselves or gap fill? Okay, so everybody ready to submit your ballots? And so this is for code 87X6X. Your choice, the recommended crosswalks to date are 87501, 87502, and 87798.
I think someone wants. Hi, I just wanted to explain the difference between those codes. 87501 is for influenza. It's an RNA virus target for a single target. 87502 is again an RNA virus influenza for 2 targets. And then the 87798 was the unidentified target that's generally priced at a DNA target. The difference between an 87501 and an 87798 is that it includes the reverse transcriptase that's necessary to convert the viral RNA into copy DNA before they can do the amplification. So there is a pricing implication between 87798 and 87501 or 2.
And that was Dr. Schoonmaker. Does the panel have any other questions, concerns? All right. I assume the panel is ready to submit their ballots. Okay. So for 87X6X, infectious agent detection by nucleic acid, DNA or RNA, Zika virus, amplified probe technique. The suggested crosswalks to date have been 87502 times 1, 87501, and 87798. Okay.
Okay, results for code 876XX. 2 recommendations to crosswalk to 87798, 8 recommendations to crosswalk to 87801, and this was Rashida Johnson.
All right. So now we're trying to get to the PLA codes. There we go. So we are now moving to the section of the CPT AMA CPT manual for the PLA codes. We're now going to discuss new PLA codes. The first code is 0001U, red blood cell antigen typing, DNA human erythrocyte antigen gene analysis of 35 antigens from 11 blood groups utilizing whole blood. Common RBC alleles are reported. Does the panel want to speak to the presenters? Any discussion amongst yourselves? Okay. Let me quickly read you the crosswalks that I have that have been suggested for this code. So for 0001U, we have suggestions to crosswalk to 81403. And certainly, if you are ready to cast your ballots, you can enter your crosswalk or gap fill.
Voting results for 87X6X. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 87798. 6 recommendations to crosswalk to 87501. 3 recommendations to crosswalk to 87503. Oh, correction. The last one is 3 recommendations to crosswalk to 87502. Okay.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next code, 0002U, if everybody has submitted their ballot for 0001U. Okay. So code 0002U is the oncology colorectal quantitative assessment of 3 urine metabolites, ascorbic acid, succinic acid, and carnitine by liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry using multiple reaction monitoring acquisition. Algorithm is reported as likelihood of adenomatous polyps. For 0002U, we have recommendations for for gap fill, and no recommendations were submitted for a crosswalk. Does the panel have any questions for the presenters? Does the panel want to discuss this? Okay, I assume everybody wants to submit their ballot for 0002U, and the suggestion from the presenters and the public was to crosswalk this code. So please indicate your recommendation for gap fill or crosswalk for this code.
Voting results for 0001U. 7 recommendations to gap fill, 3 recommendations to crosswalk to 81403.
So the next code is 0003U, oncology ovarian biochemical assays of 5 proteins, apolipoprotein A1, CA1252, follicle stimulating hormone, human epididymis protein 4, and transferrin, utilizing serum algorithm reported as a likelihood score. For 0003U, the suggestions for pricing this code from the public have been to gap fill. No suggestions for crosswalks were given. And Dr. Schoonmaker, is that what you have found?
03U, wasn't that the 4 versus 3 proteins, the ovarian test? It was 1.25. 81539 times 1.25.
I'm sorry,
81539 times 1.25. Is that what you guys remember for the ovarian test?
Yeah. And I did have a question in terms of that one.
Can you speak into the mic?
And please indicate who you are, because we're having problems hearing this.
Hi, this is Gail Marcus. And while I wasn't here yesterday, I did watch on the video, the live stream, and I had a question on this one in terms of the multiplier, so I don't know if the person who presented is here. My question being, was it just 1.25 because you're going from 4 to 5? Yeah. Was that the logic?
So this is 21st Century, who is approaching the podium. Is that correct? Yes. So please state your name and slowly and clearly. Thank you.
Good morning, John Warren, McDermott Plus Consulting, working for this Coalition for 21st Century Medicine. Yeah, it's actually a 2-part answer to your question. The first is yes, the multiplier of 25% was for the additional protein, but it was also to get too close to a crosswalk to the original OVA 1 test. The original OVA 1 test, which I think is 85103, I think is the code, does not have an NLA, so we couldn't use that as a crosswalk. But we wanted to get to a price that was close to an appropriate crosswalk for this new version.
So then if that were the choice, why not gap fill? If that's what you're looking for.
That's a fair enough question.
I'm sorry,
So-
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Karen. What was the code that did not have an NLA?
I believe it was 81503.
This is Dr. Pratt. It's 81539.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Because
Pratt.
it seems,
So if you are speaking, I'm sorry this is redundant, just indicate who you are because it helps with the people listening.
so Gail Marcus once more. So it seems to me that the 1.25 then becomes somewhat arbitrary if you're trying to get a result, and that the preferred method might be the gap fill.
So, yes. However, we believe that crosswalking is administratively simpler for the agency.
I understand that, but
Okay, so any other questions for Mr. Warren? All right, so it seems like for code 0003U, the options are crosswalk 81539 times 1.25 versus the suggestion from the panel for gap fill. Any other conversation or discussion? Okay, so so the panel can submit their ballots.
Results for 0002U, 10 recommendations to gap fill.
So the next code is 0004U, and this is infectious disease, bacterial, DNA, 27 resistance genes, PCR amplification and probe hybridization in microarray format, molecular detection and identification of AMP-C, carbapenemase, and ESBL coding genes, bacterial culture colonies, report of genes detected or not detected per isolate, and suggestions for crosswalks include 87150, and on the second, if I am correct, from the Mayo Clinic, they have suggested 87150 times 10. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Schoonmaker.
Thank you. I thought one was 87150 times 27.
That is correct.
And so I understand that the 87150 is generally a PCR, or nucleic acid amplification technology confirmation on a cultured specimen, but I'm wondering if in this case maybe a crosswalk to one of the either respiratory or GI viral panels might be more appropriate. I realize those only go from 12 to 25 targets, but the pricing was determined and recommendations accepted when those codes came up for vote based on economies of scale of not looking at, you know, the full 27 because you're only doing one DNA amplification, and it gets cheaper as you add additional analytes. But those codes seem to be in the neighborhood of pricing, and I'm just wondering if those might be more of an appropriate choice. So, I mean, I think the one that would be appropriate would be a crosswalk to something like 87633 or it's not 503. Try 87633. If either one of those speakers would like to discuss
So
that.
you would like, so the two presenters who
Because
had
Tom-
recommendations were ASM and the Mayo Clinic. So is your recommendation to speak with one or both of them?
Yes, because the ultimate pricing is going to be markedly different between a times 10 and a factor
All right.
of 27.
So do we have members? So I see the Mayo Clinic team is here. Please approach the podium, and Dr. Schoonmaker will ask her question once again for clarification. So again, this is code 0004U, and the issue is regarding the multiplier of 27 versus 10.
Right, and if you guys looked at the multiplex panel codes that are direct, they're on direct specimen, but they do encompass 12 to 25 targets, and the pricing may be similar.
We didn't look, this is Cheryl James from Mayo Clinic. We did not look at those particular codes. We had honed in on the 87150 because of it being the amplified probe technique per culture or isolate, and felt that that was a good match. I'm not quick enough with my fingers to pull up the NLA on the 87633 or the other one that you...
It's about $576. So it would be in the middle of the two recommendations, actually.
Right, and we favored the times 10. We didn't feel the times 27 was appropriate, even though we were looking at 27 genes, just because of the efficiencies of the microarray format. Felt that the 10, with the work and the resources involved, would meet the price point where we needed that to be. But, you know, if the panel feels the 87633 really is where they feel that the technology is the same, we could abide with that.
And that would be 87633 times 1?
Correct.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's also a GI panel code that I'm searching for, because for some reason it escapes me, which may be, it's priced exactly the same as the respiratory viral panels, but it has some of these kind of targets on it. Vicki may know.
Do you have any further questions for the presenters?
It's 87507 is what the GI panel code is, covering up to 25 targets.
All right, so Dr. Schoonmaker, do you want to speak to someone from ASM?
No?
Okay.
Your microphone.
This is Vicki Basowski. There are clearly economies of scale associated with multiplex testing, and the way the crosswalks were historically done with the direct specimen test reflects those economies of scale, whether it's done on a culture isolate or a direct specimen. So I actually do agree with Dr. Schoonmaker's recommendation.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to my original question. Do you need to speak with the ASM folks?
No, I don't
Great.
believe they're here.
All right. So we have on the table recommendations for, in fairness to all the presenters, 87150 times 27, and and I'm just going to give you all the suggestions: 87150 times 10, 87633 times 1. And am I understanding that 87507 is also a potential crosswalk? Yes.
Right, that's a gastrointestinal panel code. They're priced exactly the same as respiratory virus.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat it one more time for the panel. We have code 0004U. We have suggestions for crosswalks to 87150 times 27, 87150 times 10, 87633 times 1, and 87507. And Dr. Schoonmaker, I'm assuming that is also times 1.
Yes.
Okay. So please complete your ballots accordingly. And of course, gap filling is also always an option.
Voting results for 0003U. 8 recommendations to gap fill, 1 recommendation to crosswalk, 81539 times 1.25, and 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81539.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next code, 0005U, Oncology Prostate Gene Expression Profile by Real-Time RT-PCR of 3 genes, ERG, PCA3, and SPDEF, urine algorithm reported as a risk score. For this code, we had presenters who had recommended a crosswalk of 81539 and do we have any questions from the panel? Does the panel need to speak to anyone or any of the presenters? I'm assuming the panel is going to go ahead and vote on code 005U, the crosswalk suggestion of 81539. Certainly other suggestions for crosswalk and gap filling can be part of your ballot.
Voting results for 0004U. 4 recommendations to gap fill, 2 recommendations to crosswalk to 87633, 2 recommendations to crosswalk to 87507, and 2 recommendations to crosswalk to 87150 times 10.
So we are now on code 0006U, prescription drug monitoring 120 or more drugs and substances, definitive tandem mass spectrometry with chromatography, urine specimen, qualitative report of presence, including quantitative levels when detected or absence of each drug or substance, with description and severity of potential interactions with identified substances per date of service. So for this code, yes?
I just wanted to, I'll let you finish. I was going to ask the presenter a question.
Okay.
This is Gail.
So for 0006U, we have the suggestions for crosswalking to G0483. And now I'd like to open this up to the panel to ask if they would like to speak to the presenters or have any internal discussion. So, Gail Marcus.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, is the main difference between the code, the testing of interactions? Is someone here? Oh, hi. Hi.
Yes, Joel Gallanter, Aegis Sciences Corporation. Main difference, yes, probably. There is a full report, as we discussed somewhat yesterday, and I know you were listening in, of the interactions description. So there is an interactions database for all of the drugs in the profile. That is a proprietary database, and they are analyzed and scored and reported out.
And you're looking to crosswalk it to the same code that would normally be used?
It would not normally be used because the vast majority, as we discussed, the vast majority of these 120 drugs or substances are not recognized in the CPT code book.
Okay.
They're
outside of,
they're
yeah, when I saw your
outside of it.
list.
Right, they're significant, they're well prescribed, or
Right.
very well prescribed.
But they're not necessarily the illicits.
Right, they're not, most of them are not drugs of abuse,
Right.
but they interact.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions from the panel? Does the panel want to discuss this further amongst themselves? Okay, so for voting for code 0006U, We have suggestions for a crosswalk of G0483. Please complete your ballot. Certainly other crosswalks and gap filling are an option. If you are putting in any crosswalks, please make sure you indicate the code that you are suggesting or voting for.
Voting results for 005U. 6 recommendations to gap fill, 4 recommendations to crosswalk to 81539.
So for the next code, 0007U, this is a drug test or tests presumptive with definitive confirmation of positive results. Any number of drug classes. Urine the urine specimen includes specimen verification, including DNA authentication, thank you, in comparison to buccal DNA per date of service. We have suggestions for a crosswalk of 3 codes for the pricing of 0007U, 81265 times 1 plus 80307 times 0.5 plus G0480 times 0.5. We also have, okay, so that was the main suggestion presented yesterday. I think Gail Marcus has a question.
I have a question for the presenter.
So is, let's see, that would be...
Genotox.
Yes, Genotox. Is the Genotox presenter here? Okay, go ahead and ask your question.
I will raise my concerns. So in listening to this yesterday, it appeared that the DNA test was a way to get validity of the specimen, which we are not reimbursed for under urine drug testing. That is not an acceptable thing to bill. So I was going to ask the presenter whether or not why this wouldn't be just normal drug testing. If he chooses to use a DNA test for validity, validity is not reimbursed currently. So I would have said this would just crosswalk to the normal. In other words, if it's a presumptive test, then bill it presumptive. If it's definitive, bill the definitive codes. I don't understand the bringing them together and creating new codes.
So I appreciate your input. So the second half of your question is that in the code descriptor, this is a presumptive and definitive test. So that would explain, at least for me, why they have included those codes in this stack of 3.
But I believe you normally don't run definitives on every presumptive because you want to know, in other words, why are you running everything on everything if the presumptive...
Okay.
So no, it sounds like they're bundling a set of things.
Okay.
That I'm uncomfortable because he doesn't have a chance to answer me, but this looked like normal urine drug testing.
Okay. Dr. Loy?
Thank you. Brian Loy. I was wanting to just point out that in 80307, in the verbiage it says, include sample validation when performed. So I would have liked to have asked the presenter to what extent that sample validation would in fact overlap with or not be completely represented, requiring the use of the DNA testing.
Sample validation is a standard action of every one of those steps, and it's been made clear, this is Gail Marcus, sorry, and it has been made clear that we are not allowed to bill separately.
Right, or said differently or more succinctly, it's already included in 80307.
Right.
Okay, Dr. Pratt?
I would also like to clarify, at the AMA discussion, when the PLA was created, the AMA did not recommend adding an identity chimerism testing to as part of a recommended crosswalk.
So does the panel have suggestions for crosswalks outside of what was suggested by the presenters?
The only thing you could do is crosswalk it to the normal presumptive and definitive testing codes, but I think there's a question as to whether you'd automatically run them both for everything, which is what their methodology implies.
Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
Can Dr. Marcus make a recommendation about a specific crosswalk code?
I mean, you could crosswalk it to, just one, either the definitive or the quantitative code that exists. You know how they've 80307 and GO480, one of those two. Would be my suggestion. I think GO480. I have to look at the CPT book. But my suggestion would be you just bill it as a standard urine drug test, quantitative, if they're doing quantitative testing.
All right, so it sounds like if I'm understanding what the panel is, where the panel is going is to, one, consider the 3 crosswalks as outlined by the presenter, or 2, to consider the crosswalk G0480.
Yeah, I mean that, as opposed to just the presumptive, because there are 3 presumptive, 80305, 306, 307. 307 is what they're suggesting. But if they are doing quantitative testing, then I would take it up and give them the resulting quantitative code.
So,
which they're suggesting is GO480.
So, all right, so let's do this. Let me ask the panel, do you feel you have enough information to vote? Is it, okay. And as you're nodding, you feel your choices at this point in time, based on the suggestions made by the public and at this meeting here, that your two suggestions that are on the table, in addition to gap filling, are the 3 codes of 81265 times 1 plus 80307 times 0.5 plus G0480 times 0.5. That's your first suggestion. Second suggestion is G0480 times 1. And that's what you feel, okay. So then let's go ahead and vote on those 2 suggestions, as well as the option to add any other crosswalks or gap fill on your ballot if you so choose. All right, so we will move on to the next code, which is 0008U. And this is a Helicobacter pylori detection and antibiotic resistance DNA 16S and 23S rRNA GYRA PBP1 RDXA and RPOB next generation sequencing formalin fixed paraffin embedded or fresh tissue predictive reported as positive or negative for resistance to clarithromycin, fluoroquinolones, metronidazole, amoxicillin, tetracycline, and rifabutin. Okay. So we have at this point for 0008U, if I'm reading my notes correctly, this would be for gap fill. Is that what you have, Dr. Schoonmaker?
I did not have a recommendation for that.
Okay.
Voting results for 0006U, 7 recommendations to gap fill, 3 recommendations to crosswalk to G0483. Voting results for 0007U, 6 recommendations to gap fill, 3 recommendations to crosswalk to G0480, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81265.
So in reviewing my notes, I also do not have any recommendations. I'm going to open this up to the panel. Do you have any recommendations regarding crosswalk or gap fill? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Kuchar-Lapati.
I don't know the code, but you know, the technology of sequencing, and we have many different codes of gene sequencing, so I would imagine that one could apply, you know, one of those codes for this application.
So are you suggesting specific gene sequencing codes for drug resistance specifically?
What I'm saying is that you know, it doesn't matter what you're sequencing. The sequencing technologies are the same, and you know, we have a number of different genes, ribosomal RNA genes, and 5 other genes using next generation sequencing, and maybe other members of the panel already recognize that there are other codes that is possible to crosswalk.
Is the presenter here?
This is Vicki Baselski, if I could speak to this. What's unique about this, there is actually a code for sequence analysis on a bacterial isolate. I don't believe we currently have a code for sequencing done on a direct specimen or on tissue, which is what makes this code somewhat unique. So we have the option of either counting the number of targets and finding a sequencing procedure with a comparable number of targets, or viewing this as a totally novel direct specimen sequencing tool for an infectious agent.
So let's do this. I'm going to ask that this code be put aside for now. So this will be the second of 2. And in the meanwhile, we're going to move on. And I would like to speak to the panel about their recommendations for either a crosswalk or a gap fill. So they will give the panel time to do that, and then we'll circle back to this code, okay? So The next code is 0009U, and this is oncology breast cancer, ERBB2, HER2, copy number by FISH, tumor cells from formalin-fixed paraffin embedded tissue, isolated using image-based dye-electrophoresis sorting, reported as ERBB2 gene amplified or non-amplified. For this code, I'm sorry, Dr. Schoonmaker?
Yeah, so is there anybody here that was supporting that code? There is a HER2 new copy number by FISH on the physician fee schedule, and I was wondering how this one was different, besides just being a...
So are you referring to 0009U?
Yes.
Okay, great. So are the presenters here for this code?
There are no presenters. There were no presenters?
There were no presenters, okay. So... I open this up to the panel, recommendations for crosswalk or gap fill.
Brian Loy, just wondering for the
panel. Can you speak into the mic?
Brian Loy, can you, just wondering for the consideration of the panel, like to get your reactions to potentially crosswalking to 88365.
I believe that one's on the physician fee schedule.
I'm sorry?
That's on the physician fee schedule?
Okay, so we can't crosswalk to a physician fee schedule. That may be the problem.
Right, right.
But, okay, are there other in situ hybridization codes on the clinical lab fee schedule that we might consider?
It's the 880 series.
So, Dr. Pratt?
Right. This is a PLA code. This is novel technology for this company. I'm not aware that there is physician involvement for this. It's a laboratory developed test. And since there is no one here to recommend a crosswalk to that, I would recommend a gap fill.
All right. Any other suggestions for crosswalks? Does the committee have enough information to, okay, Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
So I just wanted to ask the people who on the panel who might be knowledgeable as to whether this dye electrophoresis actually provides additional clinical significant information beyond what we normally obtain from fish.
So before I go to Dr. Schoonmaker, I assume Dr. Pratt is going to answer that question?
Yes, this is Dr. Pratt. Again, this is a proprietary assay, and that I cannot comment on it, and there is no one to comment on this code from the company that performs it.
Okay, Dr. Schoonmaker?
I would agree with Dr. Pratt. I was looking for some input on the image-based dielectrophoresis, but if we don't know about that procedure, then I would concur with the recommendation to gap fill.
All right. All right, so does the committee have enough, the panel have enough information? Great. Well, okay, so for 009U, lacking any presentation or response from the owners of this code, the current suggestion is to gap fill this code. So please complete your ballots for 009U, and certainly you can add crosswalks if you feel that that may be a more fitting way to price this code. Oh, okay, hold on a second. Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
I just want to hear the recommendation for this specific crosswalk.
So
there is no specific recommendation. This is Dr. Pratt.
Right. Dr. Loy did have a specific recommendation. However, that code is covered under the PFS, not in the CLFS. So that was the conclusion. However, if the panel does, in their mind, have another crosswalk they'd like to suggest, that is also can be entered into the ballot. All right, so while Glenn's collecting those ballots for 0009U, we're going to move on to 0010U, which is the infectious disease bacterial strain typing by whole genome sequencing, phylogenetic base, report of strain relatedness per submitted isolate. For this code, there is the suggestion to crosswalk this code 0010U to two codes 87153 times 3 plus 87900. And does the, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. This is Dr.
This is Dr. Basowski, Vicki Basowski. I believe that this code was presented by Mayo, and we probably will need some discussion by them. I believe this test is done on isolates, so the code 87153 does cover that procedure on isolates, and the code 87900 does cover the bioinformatics update piece. What is unclear to me is why the multiplier of 3 was recommended, and I would like to hear some discussion of that.
So can the Mayo team approach the podium? I believe that question was asked yesterday, but we can certainly delve into that more specifically and deeply right now.
This is Cheryl James from Mayo. Basically, we did the ×3 multiplier. This is testing greater than 1,500 genes. And so the multiplier of 3 basically accounts for the difference, with 87153 basically probably being a lot fewer genes that are being sequenced than what we're sequencing in these isolates. And again, we were taking in the efficiencies for the sequencing.
Can I ask a question?
Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
In this procedure, do you just take the genomic DNA from the bacterium and sequence the entire, or you have a capture of certain genes?
It's the whole genome.
So it doesn't make any difference how many genes there are?
Correct, and the 87153 doesn't seem to, doesn't indicate how many genes, though it seems to suggest with the example that it's a fewer number.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the panel? So, I'm sorry. Can I ask a quick question? I'm
Sure.
sorry. So, is it fair to say that 3 isn't really, what is the word I'm looking for, isn't really totally mathematically accurate if you're...
No, it was more looking at a price point.
Okay. So, does Mayo think that if I'm understanding how this code works, that this code may be more appropriately crosswalked to a full gene sequencing code?
If there was a full gene sequencing code that was priced, that's what we would have chosen, but because of a full sequencing code not being priced, that's why we chose to crosswalk it to the 87153.
Times 3.
Times 3, correct.
Okay.
Plus the bioinformatics piece.
Okay. Dr. Schoonmaker.
So from a technical perspective, is there really any difference if you're sequencing a bacterial genome, a viral genome, or a human gene sequence? I mean, a lot of the codes are, we do have a code for, as Vicki said, Dr. Pixelski said, that there's a sequencing constellation per isolate of cultured material, but they're priced the same as if you were doing a direct specimen. And I'm just wondering if there's anything we could borrow either from the MolDX or whether these codes should be gap-filled to update the infectious disease microsection, in which case these should all be gap-filled, I would propose.
I'm assuming this is a question.
Unfortunately, we don't have anybody from ASM in the
I'm going to have Dr.
today.
Hopman come up, who has a little more experience with the next-gen sequencing.
Thank you.
That would be great, thank you.
And then from here, we have a question from Dr. Kuchar-Lapati.
I was going to answer Dr. Shoemaker's question, but we'll let.
Okay,
Mayo.
so that's great. I appreciate that. So let's get the input from Mayo and then from Dr. Kuchar-Lapati.
Nicole Hotman from Mayo Clinic. So when we are sequencing the whole genome of a bacteria versus just one or a few genes, it is significantly more, the cost, both to do the sequencing because we can't put as many samples on the flow cell for the instrument, and then the analysis piece on the back end, since we're looking at more genes, it takes more time and effort to look for variants in those genes.
Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
The answer to Michelle's question is the difference between viral and microbial sequencing is just the size, but no other differences.
So does the panel want to suggest a different crosswalk? No? All right. Any other questions for Mayo? And we do not have anybody here from ASM, is that correct? Okay. Thank you. All right, so for 0010U, we have the crosswalk suggestion of 87153 times 3 plus 87900. And I assume the panel wants to vote. So your choices are the suggestions, gap fill, and of course, if you put in a crosswalk to enter the code that you would crosswalk it to.
Voting results for 0009U, 9 recommendations to gap fill, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to ERBB2 FISH.
Okay, so the next code is 0011U, prescription drug monitoring, evaluation of drugs present by LC-MS/MS using oral fluid, reported as a comparison to an estimated steady state range per date of service, including all drug compounds and metabolites. So for this code, suggestions were made to crosswalk 0011U to G0480 times 1.5. And I'd like to open this up to the panel. So Gail, Marcus, you have a question?
I do. Is the person who presented this here?
So that would be from Cordant.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Okay.
we lack
Guess not.
input.
So this is Gail Marcus. The question I had is, it seemed when I was listening to him yesterday that he is testing for one drug at a time and doing a comparison to what they say is steady state using oral fluid. And my question was going to be, why isn't this more akin to therapeutic drug monitoring that you might do in blood? In other words, using oral fluid, but you're basically doing therapeutic monitoring of the drug as opposed to what's done for urine drug testing codes, which are testing for a whole range of different drugs and not doing, the steady state piece. And then the other piece was the fact that the cup had pH on it. I mean, that, again, is trying to get paid for validity, should be incorporated in it. So I was going to ask whether that individual had looked at the therapeutic codes, drug monitoring codes, and compared that test to it, because I didn't feel as though it fit with the urine drug testing codes they were using.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Loy?
So Gail, just listening to your comments, how would you feel about a recommendation to just simply crosswalk to GO480 at 1 unit? Is that reasonable?
You could, although I was looking at some of this scale, I was looking at some of the pricing on the therapeutic drug monitoring, and it's fairly low. So I don't know whether that, from a resource perspective, is similar, but it might work as an alternative. I think he would still be paid more than people are paid for therapeutic drug monitoring in blood.
Does the panel have a specific therapeutic drug monitoring code?
And this is where I start to get out the scale. I get out of my zone of what I know. So I hate to say crosswalk because it's really not different. I mean, we could go with 1 unit of that as a compromise, 1 unit of GO480.
Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
My understanding is that this is no different than drug monitoring, except in this particular case, they use oral fluid rather than urine. So everything is the same.
No, because if you listen to him talk, he is not testing for any illicit drugs. The only testing they're doing is for prescribed drugs. So they're not, normal urine drug testing tests for both prescribed and illicit and does a panel approach. This way, they think they've identified 7 drugs that they are able to track, and they're basically doing with oral fluid what is done with blood for the most part, I believe, in terms of monitoring prescribed drugs. So that's why I felt it was a little bit different. But without him here to answer,
When you do mass spec, you identify everything.
I agree. Normally you do, but the way he was describing it yesterday was we have 7 drugs we can do this for, and I think the difference is he's trying to find a steady state version, so he's doing a different kind of testing, not just absence presence, but some kind of amount. I don't know. The rest of the panel was here, and I don't know if you heard that described differently.
So am I hearing this correctly? So the suggestions for a crosswalk are as suggested by Cordon 80480 times 1.5, possibly and another crosswalk of 480 times 1. or is more discussion required? So then I would say what I'm hearing is for 0011U, the panel is ready to vote. Suggestions for crosswalk are G0480 times 1.5. Another suggestion is G0480. And of course, there's always gap fill. So, okay, so please submit your ballots.
Voting results for 0010U, 7 recommendations to gap fill, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 87153 times 1 plus 87900, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 87153 times 3 plus 87900, and 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 87153.
Okay, so we are on 0012U, and this is a code with the descriptor of germline disorders, gene rearrangement, detection by whole genome next generation sequencing, DNA, whole blood, report of specific gene rearrangement or rearrangements. The crosswalk suggested was 81316 times 2 plus 81450. Does the panel wish to ask questions of the presenter or presenters? Does the panel wish to discuss this code amongst themselves? No questions? Okay. I assume the panel wants to vote. So for 0012U, the suggestion for crosswalk were 2 codes, 81316 times 2 plus 81450. Other options are gap fill. If you are putting in a crosswalk, please indicate the number of the code.
Voting results for 0011U, 7 recommendations to gap fill, 3 recommendations to crosswalk to G0480.
That's times 1?
Correct.
Thanks. Okay, so the next code is 0013. 0013U, oncology, solid organ neoplasia, gene rearrangement detection by whole genome next generation sequencing, DNA fresh or frozen tissue or cells, report of specific gene arrangements. We have the suggestion for a crosswalk, which is made up of 2 codes, 81316 times 2 plus 81445. Does the panel want to speak or ask questions of the presenters? Any discussion amongst the panel members regarding this code and its crosswalk? Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
I just have a technical question.
Okay. Is it for us, the panel, or the presenters?
For the presenters.
Okay, hold on a second. All right, let's get the Mayo team back up to the podium. Hold on a second.
Two questions. I assume that this and the previous tests are just looking for discordant base pairs, mate pairs?
Correct.
Right. Yes. And in this particular case for oncology, what's the depth of coverage that you have to do to be able to detect these translocations?
So This is Nicole Hotman from Mayo Clinic. That's sort of a difficult question to answer. For mate pair, we don't calculate depth of coverage like we would for a next-gen sequencing assay for point mutation detection. We basically have what we call a bridged coverage. Bridge coverage means we're not necessarily covering all the base pairs by next-gen sequencing, but we're covering the genome by looking at pieces of DNA on the ends of very long fragments of DNA and how many times we would bridge a particular region, not necessarily by sequencing it, but how many times it's represented in between two pieces of DNA, if that makes some sense. So our bridge coverage is typically 30 to 60x.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Pratt?
You add in 81450 is is a genomic sequencing procedure for heme path. It does include gene rearrangements. You add in for your recommendation PML RARA ×2 for gene rearrangements. Why are you adding an additional CPT codes and not just crosswalking it to 81450?
And Cheryl, please come up if you feel like you can add anything to this. But basically, we felt that the 81450 covered the actual sequencing costs for us. And then the additional work that we have to do to actually look at the rearrangements, which is always at least 2 rearrangements, we felt was covered by the 81316.
Rearrangements are included in 81450.
They are correct. Cheryl, do you want to add anything?
Cheryl James from Mayo. We included the 81316 because of the translocation analysis description in the code for a single breakpoint with the mate pair, as Dr. Hotman was explaining, and especially with the oncology, we're looking at least 6 breakpoints on average with an oncology specimen. And so, again, we felt the work representative, that translocation analysis of having to do that library for the specific and then go on to the whole genome sequencing is why we added the 2 codes together.
Dr. Pratt, you have any other questions before I?
No.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Morrison?
The speaker from Mayo. If I'm correct, the majority of laboratories do 81316 by Taqman assay, and there really isn't a translocation analysis. Basically, it's the presence or absence of a product. So you do not determine, you know a priori whether or not the translocation exists and what you are to predict. So what was your rationale for comparing a Taqman assay to next-gen sequencing?
So I can speak for the clinical piece of this. This is Nicole from Mayo Clinic again. When we do this test, we know that there is a translocation or a rearrangement, and we know which chromosomes are involved, but we don't necessarily know what genes are involved. We may have a suspicion. We might think that, for example, PML is involved, but we don't know until we actually do the testing which genes are involved.
But how do you compare a Taqman assay to next-gen sequencing?
We really focused on, this is Cheryl James from Mayo, we really focused on the 81316 from the perspective that it was a translocation analysis for a single break point. We didn't focus on what the methodology was to be used. We narrowed in on that description for what it was saying it was doing.
So if you take that logic, you know, we have probably 20 codes that we could use for a translocation analysis, right? You know, so why didn't we choose another one? Why didn't we choose the fish code, right? What's the logic that's unique about PMLR?
There wasn't any logic except that description said translocation analysis. The only other translocation analysis CPT code in the Tier 1 are your BCR ABLs. And we felt the description under the 81316 was more descriptive, more specific of that translocation analysis with a single breakpoint.
Thank you.
So based on this discussion, Are there any other questions coming from the panel for Mayo? Okay. Gail?
This is Gail Marcus. I just wanted to ask the committee, those of you that are more familiar, whether you have a recommendation for this.
And when you mean a recommendation?
Meaning any of the committee members who might think
A recommendation for a
crosswalk?
A crosswalk.
A crosswalk, if you thought there was one.
Dr.
Well,
Morrison?
the fact that we don't have any GSP codes for whole genome sequencing, I really can't find a crosswalk.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other discussion? So for 0013U, the suggestions for crosswalk are 81316 times 2 plus 81445. Please cast your ballots.
Voting results for 0012U, 7 recommendations to gap fill, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81316, 2 recommendations to crosswalk to 81316 times 2 plus 81450.
So the next code is 0014U. It's hematology, hematolymphoid neoplasia, gene rearrangement, detection by whole genome, next generation sequencing, DNA, whole blood, or bone marrow. Report a specific gene rearrangement or rearrangements. So we have a suggested crosswalk of 81316 times 2 plus 81450. And okay, so I think Mayo should probably come to the podium just in case. And we have a question from Dr. Pratt.
81445 is solid organ neoplasia, and this is a hematology or hematolymphoid, which would be 81450. So why do you recommend a crosswalk to a solid tumor as opposed to the hematolymphoid?
We did, this is Cheryl James from Mayo. We did crosswalk it to the A1450 for the hematologic specimen.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Any other questions from the panel? Okay, so for, one last question. Do you guys want to discuss this before we cast your ballots? Okay, so 0014U, crosswalk suggested is 81316 times 2 plus 81450. Other options are gap fill. If you're using the crosswalk, please indicate the code. Thank you.
Voting results for 0013U, 8 recommendations to gap fill, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81316 times 2 plus 81445, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81316.
So the next code is 0015U. Drug metabolism, adverse drug reaction, DNA, 22 drug metabolism, and transported genes, real-time PCR, blood or buccal swab, genotype, and metabolizer status for therapeutic decision support. And I believe the presenter was not here, and if the panel would like to hear from a representative for this code, please let me know. Can you put your placards up if you want to hear from the presenter? Okay, so we have the representative here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Bruce Quinn. I'm a pathologist. I'm a retired local Medicare medical director, and I'm serving as a consultant for OneOhm. OneOhm was very proud to have one of the early PLA codes, but they anticipated they'd be in next year's summer gap fill process. So they were not aware of the July 14th deadline. Very briefly, this is an independent lab in Minnesota. It was co-founded by Mayo Clinic, shares intellectual property with Mayo Clinic, has existed since 2013. The code represents a sole source proprietary lab test. They have 22 drug metabolism and transporter genes. They provide an extensive bioinformatics database that tracks several hundred drugs and provide one consolidated one-stop shopping for the pharmacogenetic profile. By our count, there are 12 sequencing-based panels, of which 9 are priced. The price panels you can use for a crosswalk have a minimum of 5 genes, 8 genes, 10 genes, or 14 or more genes. This panel has mandatory 22 genes. Therefore, we're recommending a crosswalk to 81432, which is the existing crosswalk that has 14 or more genes, the best fit to 22 or more genes. We'd like to mention that the list price is $1,300. Current price from payers under multiple gene coding, such as the cytochrome oxidase genes, averages $1,100. They do not perform full sequencing, but the same is true for the 7 cytochrome oxidase genes that now have codes. All of those are for common variants, not for full sequencing, and they're frequently $200, $300, $400 per code. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Gail Marcus.
Hi, Gail Marcus. Is this then primarily a metabolism test for the patient?
It's a pharmacogenetic profile, so it includes 22 genes. They include 7 of the CYP family genes. They include some point mutations like in factor 2 and factor 5. They include genes like thyropyramine methyltransferase. They include serotonin transporters. They include COMT, which is in the monoamine pathway.
Okay.
It's a diverse 22 gene panel, many of which are represented by now increasingly tier 1 codes or also tier 2 codes.
Any other questions from the panel? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Morrison.
So if you were recommending a crosswalk, what would your recommendation be?
We would recommend to 81432, which is $932. That's a good fit to the list price. It's a good fit to actual prices of payers. And it's the existing panel code that has 14 or more genes. We are 22 or more genes. So when you look to the family of existing crosswalks, it's our closest fit, and we would recommend that.
Gail?
Yes, Gail Marcus, but what is the relative cost of it versus, you said your list price is $1,400. What about the underlying cost?
I don't have lab data on the underlying costs. I think we'd refer to what people are getting for the cytochrome oxidase genes, which are variably $180, $250. Some of them go up to about $380. So we would, refer in a crosswalk process to the existing crosswalk prices. And then compared to that, there's a huge discount if you go to the $900 flat fee.
I'm sorry, what was the list price again?
They've $1,300 list price and $1,100 through code stacking in terms of actual receipts, $1,100.
Okay. If there are no other questions, thank you, Dr. Quinn.
And thank you for the chance to comment. Appreciate it.
Yep. So 0015U, suggested crosswalks for this code is 81432 times 1. Any further discussion? All right. Complete the ballots.
Voting results for 0014U, 8 recommendations to gap fill, 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81787. Correction. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81316 times 2 plus 81450. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81316.
So the next code is 0016U. It's oncology, hematolymphoid neoplasia, RNA, BCR/ABL1 major and minor breakpoint fusion transcripts, quantitative PCR amplification, blood or bone marrow, report of fusion not detected or detected with quantitation. So I don't think we had a presenter on this. This is from University of Iowa Department of Pathology. Okay, so I'm going to open this up to the panel for discussion, recommend on their thoughts. Dr. Schoonmaker and then Dr. Pratt.
Probably going to say the same thing. There are existing codes for both the major and minor breakpoints for BCR-ABL. One is 81206 for the major breakpoint. The other is 81207 for the minor breakpoint, and that includes qualitative and quantitative analysis. So my suggestion would be to crosswalk to 81206 plus 81207.
Dr. Pratt?
I was going to make the same comment. The only point for minor discussion would be there would be some minor duplication of effort if you did them both individually, but I don't think that would be significant.
Dr. Loy?
Dr. Pratt, would just ask of you that minor duplication, could you elaborate on that a bit more? I don't know where the work components of that duplication would be, so is there some adjustment?
It would primarily be in the RNA extraction if you did it just individually. Those codes were originally created for to include monitoring, so usually you do a qualitative to see if it's positive or negative, and then when you're monitoring a patient over time, you know what the break point is, and you just monitor them. So the extra would be an RNA extraction, which would be somewhere in the $5 to $10 range, and that would be the only thing.
Okay.
So, I'm sorry, any other questions, Dr. Loy?
One final, do those codes that you're describing as potential crosswalks, do they pay similarly?
We'd have to look that up.
Yeah, the 81206 is $224.91. The 81207 is $198.68. So, and normally if they're done sequentially, that presumably would take care of your difference.
For the labor, probably I would recommend just a crosswalk against 81206 would really account for the entire service or
So
amount of effort.
Okay, so could you restate that, because I want to make sure I'm clear. So you're recommending crosswalk to one single code, is that correct?
My recommendation would be to crosswalk to 81206, and that would account for the entire service.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Dr. Schoonmaker?
Yeah, I guess that would depend on whether they were detected simultaneously or sequentially.
They're detected simultaneously.
Okay. Then I concur with Vicki.
Dr. Loy? Dr. Loy, do you have any other questions? Dr. Schoonmaker?
No, but the quantitative part, can you do two quantitative PCRs in the same reaction? Again.
Yes.
All right, so Dr. Schoonmaker, I assume you just forgot to put your card down?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, thanks. So what I'm hearing from the panel for this code that had no presenter, no crosswalk, no suggestions for gap fill is to, the suggestion from the panel is 81206 times 1. Is that correct? And, okay. Dr. Schoonmaker?
Still be inclined to add at least a multiple of the 81207 for the second amount of interpretation.
If that is the case, what percentage are you going to recommend?
Probably 0.5 then?
So you are so we now have two suggestions on the table. 81206. The second suggestion is 81206 plus 81207 times 0. Was it 0.5? Okay. Do we have any more discussion? Okay. So for 0016U from the panel, the two suggestions for crosswalk, I'm going to say it one more time, just so everybody's clear, 81206 or 81206 times 1 plus 81207 times 0.5. So please fill out your ballots. Certainly gap fill is an option.
Voting results for 0015U. 5 recommendations to gap fill, 5 recommendations to crosswalk to 81432.
So the next code is 0017U. It's excuse me. Is that correct? I'm sorry. Right, so it's 0017U. Sorry about that. It's oncology, hematolymphoid neoplasia, JAK2 mutation, DNA, PCR, amplification of exons 12 through 14, and sequence analysis, blood or bone marrow, reported JAK2 mutation not detected or detected. I'm sorry, Dr. Pratt.
I hide behind Glenn.
Yes, I kind of noticed that.
For JAK2, there is an existing JAK2 code, 81270. It is sequence analysis, or it's analysis of the V617F variant only. The preponderant, most people actually do this testing by doing sequence analysis. In this PLA code, it is actually sequencing of exons 12 and 14, so it is a little bit more than just looking for one variant, but probably a similar amount of work involved. So a recommendation would be to crosswalk it to 81270.
Any other discussion from the panel? Let me just fill the folks in. Obviously, we don't have a presenter, and there was no presenter yesterday. This is a code from the University of Iowa's Department of Pathology. So for code 0017U, the suggestion on the part of the panel is to crosswalk it to 81270 times 1. So, I'm sorry, Dr. Morrison?
I would suggest some multiple or choose another code that has more variants, such as a KRAS or an NRAS. Doesn't necessarily, there's nothing unique about JAK2, it's the technology and the number of variants that we're detecting. So I think we should either put a ×2 or
So can you, I'm sorry, Dr. Morrison, can you speak into the microphone?
I would suggest we either put a ×2 or we choose another gene that has an extended sequencing, more variants like KRAS or NRAS. The crosswalk would be more appropriate.
Dr. Loy?
There is an expanded KRAS code. Is that on the clinical lab fee schedule, or is that on the physician? Does anybody know?
So KRAS is 81275, and that is gene analysis variants in exon 2, codons 12 and 13, and then there's 81276, that's additional variants, codon 61 and 146.
And that might be appropriate to use those two codes as a crosswalk.
So that was Dr. Morrison speaking. Dr. Loy?
So back to the common theme here. If we crosswalk to one with a multiplier or a crosswalk to both, is there a reduction of one or both of those codes that we should be considering?
So could we ask what the current fee schedule price is for those three codes?
For 81270, it's 125.74. For 81275, it's 198.57. And what was the other one?
81276
Is the same as 198.57.
So it's not remarkably different, but an additional $40 by choosing KRAS or $40 less by choosing a multiple of JAK2. That's Dr. Morrison.
Okay.
So, I'm sorry, Dr. Morrison, we could barely hear what you were saying.
I was just saying the difference between the choice is less than $50, so, but there is a difference.
Okay. However, I think we need to focus on the fact that you want to look at the methodology and try to get something as close as possible to be consistent with the statutory language.
Well, I suppose if we were focusing just on methodology, we'd have to know a little more detail about what they say when they say exon, two separate exons. Are they going for hotspots in those two exons like you would be in KRAS or NRAS, or are they looking for any variant that's in those two exons? So without the presenter here giving more details of the technology, we're kind of at a loss.
Okay. Dr. Pratt.
It would be very similar to KRAS sequencing.
It like this, Dr. Morrison, this likely is since JAK2 is an oncogene that they're looking for particular variants.
Yes, that is correct.
So based on the information you have, I have heard 3, possibly 2 crosswalks. The first crosswalk is 81270 times 1. And another suggested crosswalk, and this is where I was not sure where the panel was going. Is it 81275?
Yes, correct.
Plus.
81275.
Plus?
81276.
Got it.
No, my recommendation would be 81275 by itself.
Okay, so we have 3 recommendations on the table. We have 81270 times 1, 81275 times 1, and we have 81275 plus 81276. Any further discussion? All right, so code 0017U, no presenter for guidance today based on the recommendations of the panel. There were 3 crosswalks suggested, 81270 times 1, 81275 times 1, and the third is 81275 plus 81276. Please complete your ballots. Obviously, gap filling is an option.
Voting results for 0016U, 1 recommendation to gap fill, 4 recommendations to crosswalk to 81206, 5 recommendations to crosswalk to 81206, plus half of 81207. Oh, correction. 5 recommendations to crosswalk to 81206 plus 21207 times 0.5.
Go ahead. So just hold on a second. We're doing a little more administrative housekeeping.
Okay. So I'm going to repeat the voting results. 1 recommendation to gap fill, 4 recommendations to crosswalk to 81206, 5 recommendations to crosswalk to 81206 plus 81207 times 0.5.
So we're going to move on to the next section, and we have 2 codes under the heading of Other. So the next code is O2X1T, infectious agent detection by nucleic acid, DNA, or RNA, human papillomavirus for 5 or more separately reported high-risk HPV types, such as Ines' gene typing. So there's quite a few numbers, and in the interest of time, it's being presented on the screen. So I don't believe we had a presenter for this. And Dr. Schoonmaker would like to.
We did have a presenter.
Right, I believe we did have 2 recommendations. One was 87624, and then one was 87623, 87624, 87625, but it wasn't clear whether those should be added together or just pick one of them. The way these have been historically reported is that if you actually report out the subtype, that would be an individual unit of service, but if you report out a group, it would be more like an 87801 where it's multiple organisms. So I'm not quite sure whether this is saying 5 or more separately reported HPV risk types. So I guess I'm not clear as to whether ASM was reporting adding those 3 together or picking one of the existing HPV nucleic acid amplification codes.
So we had comments on this code from ASCP, ASM, and AMP. Are any of the presenters here?
AMP is here. Can AMP come to the podium?
Yes. You may approach the podium and please let us know your name.
Dr. Sam Corin with AMP. Dr. Sorecki presented many codes yesterday, as you're aware. This was a Category 3 code, so we were a little surprised to be pricing it. We did recommend the 87624 as the crosswalk, but recognizing some ambiguity in the code description, where there's 5 or more separately reported high-risk HPV types, we can accept the idea that there is additional resources involved here, and so can respect a multiplier of 87624 as a recommendation. I guess we've contemplated withdrawing our recommendation given that it's a Category 3 code, but we'll wait to continue to hear the discussion.
Well, as an example too, we voted on RSV today, which was a code that was reporting detection of both RSV-A, RSV-B, but positive for RSV. And that was crosswalk to the 87801, or that was the majority of the recommendations for detection of multiple organisms simultaneously. So that's why my question on this one.
So I have a question for AMP. So yesterday the recommendation was for 87624. So are you now changing your recommendation to 87264 times a multiplier? If yes, what is the multiplier that you are suggesting?
Could I have a moment?
Sure.
Get back to you.
Sure, okay. So, I'm sorry. Do you want to? All right, so we're going to have another speaker to come, and he's going to introduce himself.
Yes, my name is Michael Beebe. I'm a consultant to BD. I help them get this code. It's my understanding that Category 3 codes are not generally priced on the clinical laboratory fee schedule. So for that reason, we were not here today to make a pricing recommendation and did not send in a pricing recommendation because we did not believe it would be priced, just for background.
All right.
So should we, this is Dr. Pratt, so should we withdraw this from the ballot?
So Can you hold on a second real quick? I need to touch bases with the division director on this. Okay, so we will withdraw 02X1T from the list of other codes to be considered. And we are going to go to G0499, hepatitis B screening in non-pregnant high-risk individuals. High-risk individual includes hepatitis B surface antigen, HBs antigen, followed by a neutralizing confirmatory test for initially reactive results and antibodies HPS antigen, anti-HBs, and hepatitis B core antibody or anti-HBC. So this code had suggestions for crosswalks. The first one was to crosswalk it to 87341 plus 86706 plus 86704. There were other suggestions because it was unclear on the intent of how this code would be used. Another suggestion, another presenter suggested two options. Option A was to crosswalk it to 87340. That's the hepatitis B surface antigen. Another option from the same presenter, or option B, was to crosswalk to the sum of all tests, and that would be using 86704, 86706, 87340, and 87341. Excuse me, 87341.
Could you repeat that one more time?
So there were two suggestions. Actually, there were three presenters, two of which presented the same information. So there are two recommendations. Both of them require multiple codes. The first suggestion is to crosswalk to 87341 plus 86706 plus 86704. Plus 87, okay, let me start all over. One suggestion was to crosswalk it to four codes: 87341, 86706, 86704, excuse me, three. I'm sorry, the first suggestion was those first three codes. The second, or two other presenters presented two separate options. Option A is to crosswalk it to 87340. And the second option is to crosswalk to 86704 plus 86706 plus 87340. And Dr. Brzezinski would like to say something.
Yeah, this is Vicki Basowski. I believe that the purpose of this HCPCS code is to support the screening benefit that's described in the National Coverage Analysis for Hepatitis B Screening, which is, I think, 00447N. And if you go back and look at that National Coverage Determination, it's a combination of three tests, the way I read it, which is the surface antigen, the anti-HBs, and the anti-core antibody. The confirmatory test would only be done as a reflex test on an initially positive sample, so it seems not reasonable to add that into the bundle. So the bundle would be the surface antigen, the surface antibody, and the core antibody.
That's the 706 and 704.
Yeah, 87340, 86706, and 86704, I believe.
Dr. Schoonmaker? Okay. Gail Marcus?
Yes, just a quick question. Is there any synergies from doing all three together?
So please speak into your mic because we can't hear you.
Hi, Gail Marcus. Is there any synergy, do you think, from doing the three tests that should be reflected as opposed to just additive? Thought I would pick up on my colleagues' point.
This is Vicki Baselski. Again, going back to the national coverage determination, the three tests are described as being used in tandem for synergy.
Are there, I'm sorry, it's Gail again. So are there any steps that are not, that might be redundant, that get eliminated when you do the three, or no? No? Okay.
Dr. Loy?
Okay. Could you please restate the codes?
Okay. So, all right. So there are two presenters who had the same set of options. Option A was to crosswalk G0499 to 87340. Option B was 86704 plus 86706 plus 87340 and 87341. There was another presenter who recommended that this code G0499 be crosswalked to 87341 plus 86706 plus 86704. So in essence, you have the three suggestions. One suggestion recommends a single code, a second suggestion recommends 3 codes, and a third suggestion recommends 4 codes.
So the difference is you use 340 over 341.
So, I'm sorry, you are, okay, does the panel want to hear from ACLA?
Yes, please.
Okay, so please approach the table, thank you. I mean the podium.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure, sorry, Paul Shives with the American Clinical Laboratory Association. I just wanted to make sure we were clear. We weren't really recommending, like, you know, okay, when we look at this code, you could do it one of 2 ways based on a single interpretation of the code, right, being a single crosswalk or the sum of the parts. What we were really kind of asking for, and I don't know if CMS can provide this, is it's a G code, is we didn't really understand the intent of the code. And so it's almost like you have to figure out first what the code's saying. Are we saying that we're first going to be doing the Hep B surface antigen, you know, then it describes confirmatory testing. That's typically done from a coding perspective where you have an initial service, you receive that result, and you have other codes which describe the follow-up work. That was kind of where we were on our recommendation, is we didn't know if this was supposed to be a bundle of everything, because again, it's kind of a reflex testing type of situation.
Does the panel have any other questions?
I think it would be useful, this is Vicki Baselski, I think it would be useful if someone from CMS could verify that the intent of this code is for that national coverage determination screening benefit for hepatitis B, because when I reread that last night, it looked as if the 3 tests were intended to support that. And I know we have other precedent of establishing G codes for a screening benefit for HCV, for HIV, I believe for HPV as well. There are codes recommended, and the G code is used to distinguish it from diagnostic testing.
So let me just answer that first question. So yes, this is for a coverage determination. And the second issue is, it's not really an issue. We are going to have, try at least to have CAG, the clinical assessments group come down and answer some of your questions. So having said that, if the panel is okay with that, we would like to put this code aside so that they can come down and answer your questions. So this will be the third code that we are putting aside. All right. So we are going to move on to the next category, which are the Reconsider Codes. It's the single code 81327. And this is the code in which it was discussed last year and final determinations were made. And it was decided based on the request for reconsideration to bring this code back today. So 81327 is the septin-9 colorectal cancer methylation analysis, and recommendations, or not recommendations, suggestions for reconsideration was to crosswalk it to 81288. Does the panel have any questions for the presenters who suggested the crosswalk of 81288? Any discussion? Okay, Dr. Hamilton?
Recused due to a paid consultantship.
All right, thank you. Does the panel have any discussion? No? Would the panel like to vote at this time? All right. So for code 81327, the suggestion for a crosswalk is 81288.
Voting results for 0017U, 1 recommendation to gap fill, 7 recommendations to crosswalk to 81275, 2 recommendations to crosswalk to 81275 plus 81276.
So at this time, what I'd like to do is go back to the 3 codes, 002U, 0008U, and hopefully by the time we get through those other 2 codes, CAG will be here to answer a few questions.
But we did
I think
zero
we did 2U.
2U.
They re-pulled it, didn't they?
Oh, it's 8. Yeah.
Okay. 8786X7X.
So, I'm sorry. So we want to do 0008U, 86X7X, and G0499. I believe the issue with 0008U was to speak with the panel about recommendations for potential crosswalk versus gap fill. So we have Dr. Basalski and then Dr. Schoonmaker.
Oh, I'm just, are we on 0008U?
Yes.
Okay, I'll restate my previous comment, which was that we do not have a precedent or an existing code for next generation sequencing for markers such as this. So this would be novel in its application to microorganisms. Having heard discussion that nucleic acid is nucleic acid, if someone could propose a code for eukaryotic nucleic acids that matched this target number, that would probably be acceptable, but I'm not familiar enough with those codes to make a recommendation. Otherwise, a gap fill would be appropriate.
Dr. Schoonmaker?
Thank you. I was just going to add actually a little bit more color to Vicky's comment is the 87153 that was referenced earlier is slated for each isolate. And I believe a lot of the microbiology codes were termed each isolate historically because they came into implementation and use before we really could do a lot of subtyping by genetic factors or drug resistance factors. And so those codes are starting to evolve to recognize those kind of things. And so I think using 87153 times 1 would be really inappropriate because each isolate, as we've heard before in other tests, could be evaluated for, in this case, 6 different genes. You're looking at FFPE. It's a really complicated code, and it's much more work than if you tried to do it times 1. So I would actually concur with Vicky's recommendation to gap fill this code so that we could update this section with the newer technology.
So is there any other comment from the panel? So for 8008U, the panel, Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
I just wanted to make a comment that it doesn't matter whether you're looking at eukaryotic or prokaryotic sequences. DNA is DNA, and it's just look at 7 genes, and I can't recall what the codes are, but there are plenty of codes for sequencing genes. So I don't see any reason why we cannot crosswalk.
This is Dr. Pratt, and what is your recommendation?
Perhaps some panel member will be able to talk about a code that is for sequencing similar numbers of genes, 6 or 7 genes.
The only issue, though, is each isolate. So I don't know that there's additional purification or something that might have to go on if you're looking at fresh tissue and isolates. So, which is why I would recommend gap fill versus, a macro dissection or something like that. I don't think it's that straightforward.
Dr. Kuchar-Lapati?
I have nothing to add.
Okay. So it seems that your choices are for 0008U to gap fill, or if you have a stroke of insight for a crosswalk to put that in your ballot. So for 0008U, please cast your ballots.
Voting results for 81327. 7 recommendations to crosswalk to 81288. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81287. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81288 or 81327.
So we're going to go back to code 86.
I'll repeat the voting results for 81327. 7 recommendations to crosswalk to 81288. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81287. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81288 or 81327.
So we're going to do a little bit of house cleaning and get this straightened out real quick. Are you going to read the next one? Are you going to read the next one? That one? Okay, let's see what they found out.
At least they're not asleep back there. That proves that.
All right, revised results for 81327. 8 recommendations to crosswalk to 81288. 1 recommendation to crosswalk to 81287. Results for 0008U, 10 recommendations to gap fill.
This is the crosswalk, and this is where we're having problems. Wait, one thing, let me make sure. So this, I don't know if she did this backwards. This is Dr. Sutton. 4 of them. So we're going to return back to 86X, 7X. This is the Zika Virus Igm. And the crosswalk is to 86536. And we have some of the panel members who have voted for 86356. So we're wondering if there was an error with transposition of numbers. So what we're going to do is Glenn's going to give it back to everybody, their ballot, just to make sure they are clear, and then we'll recollect them real quick.
This is Gail. Could you just reconfirm the crosswalk once more?
The crosswalk that I have that suggested by the presenters is 86536. And and there was another crosswalk, 86790. So there were two potential crosswalks. And there was some question about a third crosswalk, 86356. Not suggested by the presenters, but indicated by some members, and we just want to make sure this was not transposed. Vicki?
Can I add a discussion comment? Because my ballot threw in a different code too that was not discussed, and I just want to make people aware of code 86788, which is West Nile virus, IgM. So it is a related virus for IgM that never came up during discussion, and it just was sort of a stroke of insight I had as I was casting my ballot.
What is the NLA? What is the NLA for that?
NLA for that is, I have it written down, 20-something, 2311.
Could you please restate the code number?
86788, West Nile virus IgM.
All right, so we now have, so now we're going backwards a little bit. So we're going to, for 8687X, the Zika virus IgM, we now are trying to clarify a few things. But now we've reopened this. Is that what I'm hearing from the panel, to discuss yet another suggestion?
Well, 86536 doesn't exist.
Okay.
Take that one off the table.
Okay.
Mine is okay.
All right, so we have clarification for the mysterious code. So in the presenters meant to say it should be 86356. There is no 86536. So let's go back to square one from the presenters. The suggestions are 86356, 86790. From the panel is throwing in another suggestion, 86788. So is there any other discussion? I believe Dr. Morrison, did you want to say something?
No, I wanted to say the same, that it looked like 86536 is not a valid code.
Okay, thank you.
And we just had a misposition in the data, you know.
So, okay, all right, thank you. All right, so Dr. Loy?
Yeah, and I would just want to go back to...
Can you speak into the microphone, please?
Yes, I wanted to go back to the earlier panel comment, and is there any elaboration of why we might want to select 86788 over 86356 that anyone would care to opine on?
Vicki?
Yeah, this is Vicki Basowski. As I understood it from the presenter, and the presenter may want to make comment, this was an EUA, and the justification for selecting a different code was a financial one, to have an increased reimbursement because of the EUA status. That is questionable in my mind when there is a related flavivirus with an IgM analyte existing code that is comparable in its utility. So that was my reasoning for making that suggestion.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the panel? All right, so please cast your votes for 86X, 7X. Your choice, the recommendations, no, the suggestions were for 86356, 86790, 86788. So we're going to go back to the G0499, the code for hepatitis screening in pregnant individuals. And we are unfortunate in that we cannot get someone, someone is not readily available to answer the panel's questions. So we go back to how the panel would like to price this code. And let me just say, we have about 5 more minutes before we probably need to stop for about 5 or 10 minutes because some of the panel members will be leaving. Dr. Schoonmaker.
So building on what Dr. Paselski had said, if the screening code was for the NCD, would we crosswalk it to the hepatitis surface B antigen code? Because if that was positive, then you could go ahead and build a confirmatory code separately. It wouldn't be part of that initial bundle. Would that be consistent?
I think the only people that can answer that question, this is Vicki Basowski, is the coverage analysis group, because it's not clear when I read that coverage determination whether the 3 codes are included or not.
So we're getting some background information here. We can have someone down here to answer your questions in 10 minutes. What we can do is take a break until 11:30, how about yeah, why don't we have everybody back here by,
Do we really, I don't think anyone has to leave until noon. Do we need to take a break? Can we go on with other topics?
A 5-minute break would be nice.
Okay. Well, I mean, some of us
all right,
like to
so,
hear the other discussions.
okay, so this is what we're going to do. Rashida's going to read the last set of votes that we received, and we're going to take a break until 11:25. Okay? I know some of you would like to leave, but let's. Some people probably could benefit from a physiologic break. Okay.
Okay, the voting results for 86X7X. 7 recommendations to crosswalk to 86788. 3 recommendations to crosswalk to 86356.
All right, and please, everyone be back in 6 minutes.
streaming? Because we don't really need to live to the airport to try code.
The ladies will let us go
Then why can't we get the cab? Because we don't need to leave at 12. We've never said that.
So,
Off on the ship.
yeah, she is right outside to your right.
Yes. Hi. And you are? Oh, okay. That's right. Yeah, I have to say it's
Yes. Anyone understands
exactly.
there's like
Yeah.
interesting. I that is revising the issue new code for 2017, sort of valuing crosswalk
Okay, so if everyone could take their seats
Yeah.
so we can get started on our session 2, which are the automated test panels. And can, okay, that's right. So in session 2, we had hoped to speak to the panel about getting more information regarding the automated test procedure panels. I know that last year there was a subcommittee and recommendations were made. What I'd like to do in this session is to really just go over the recommendations that were provided last year, and I realize that July 16, 2017 is incorrect. It should read July 19th of 2016. Once we briefly go over what was recommended last year, we're going to have 2 presenters. They will have 7 minutes to present. There will be a few minutes for the panel to ask them questions. And then after that, we will have panel deliberations and then a summary of further recommendations based on what you have heard from the presenters today. So last year, in the final recommendations, which can be found on the CLFS website, recommendations were made by the subcommittee. You will notice that there were 3 recommendations made, as well as pros and cons listed. The first recommendation was to have CMS pay the CPT panels and then to pay additionally each single test, and that would be paid separately. Obviously, the pros for this under PAMA would be this type of recommendation would be easiest to comply with the final rule. It would be most, I wouldn't say difficult, it would definitely increase the cost to Medicare. The subcommittee's second recommendation was to pay the CPT panels as well as a separate payment for single tests, not part of the panels, but the difference between 1 and 2 is that under 2, a limit would be set at the number of individual test codes that would be paid additionally to the panel. The pros for this, obviously, is that it would limit the payments to similar prices for panels, and then the con would be the payment for the first code would likely be set pretty low, and then there would be the potential to promote inappropriate panel use by other, by people who would be writing for these tests. The third option was to create G codes for the CPT panels and to remove those individual CPT panel codes. And we would not recognize the individual CPT codes either, and we would pay for the CPT panels codes using PAMA data. In order to carry out this option, there would be an implementation option, and that is the people who would be ordering these panels would have to list on their claims the individual codes that are making up that panel. The pros for this option would be that it clearly maintains transparency, so that even though there is a G code, everyone would know exactly what automated test panel code went into that ATP G code. The con would be that would be a potential software problem for the labs, and it would become burdensome for the labs to carry this out. Another option would be we would simply ask the people who are ordering these tests not to list the CPT codes. The major pro for this is that it's easier to implement, and the con is that the potential for medical necessity and utilization becomes a problem, and we lose all specificity regarding that ATPG code. So these were the recommendations from the subcommittee last year. What I'd like to do is open the floor up for panel discussion. And do we have our first presenter? So it's Dr. David Smalley from the National Independent Laboratory Association. And Dr. Smalley, I don't know if they shared with you, but you have about 7 minutes to present. Thank you.
No problem.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm David Smalley. I'm president of the American Esoteric Laboratories, an independent laboratory network in Tennessee and in the Mid-South. I'm here today on behalf of the National Independent Laboratory Association, or NILA, representing small community-based and multi-state regional independent laboratories. NILA certainly welcomes the opportunity to have a continued dialogue with CMS and the PAMA advisory panel on automated chemistry test panels, particularly following the first mandatory PAMA test rate reporting process. For my laboratory and so many others, collecting and assessing pricing information about individual test components within a test panel was an extremely difficult undertaking. The reason for this is that most times, though not always, payers pay for chemistry test codes on a bundle basis rather than on individual test basis. Sometimes payers do this even with physicians had ordered the tests as individual tests. For our laboratory, we bill for the test in the manner they were ordered, unless the physician ordered a set of tests that should be billed as a recognized panel in accordance with the CPT guidelines. However, regardless of how we bill a given payer, a payer will remit payment in several different ways. Frequently, we will receive payment that does not identify a specific payment rate for individual tests. We also found in going through the PAMA data collection process that payers are inconsistent from each other and oftentimes inconsistent themselves in how they issue such payments. I can offer 3 different scenarios of how private payers reimburse laboratories for automated chemistries. Some often offer remittance that does not outline specific prices for individual tests or panel tests billed, rather paying a single amount for all tests billed. When this happens, it's not possible for a laboratory to break out what is paid for each test. The payment issued is not attributed to the CPT codes billed. It's also inaccurate for a laboratory to appropriate the amount paid between the CPT codes in absence of any additional data from the payer. Some other payers provide payments on individual chemistry tests that were billed, but the amount varies by how many tests are billed rather than which specific tests are billed. It's not fair or accurate to attribute the bundle payment across tests as final payment rates, as the payment rate is reflective of a bundle and not individual test rates. Then there are circumstances where a payer has a set payment rate for each chemistry test. In this situation, the lab is provided the payment on the specific test. A lab's challenge in sifting through all these different scenarios and collecting, certifying the accuracy of payment data was made worse by CMS' decision to require retrospective data collection. CMS released regulatory guidance outlining the codes labs were to report in September 2016. This provided laboratories less than 3.5 months to reconstruct 6 months of billing data, certify, and report data for a PAMA reporting process that began in January 2017. 3.5 months to prepare and assess the accuracy of the data imposed an extreme and unnecessary regulatory burden on laboratories. Many labs spent many thousands of dollars scrambling to prepare. Some of these labs pulling their administrative staff, sometimes 1 or 2 in the lab, only focused on PAMA, disrupting the day-to-day operations. For small community laboratories in particular, this is extremely burdensome for many. The complexity and inconsistency of how payers pay for chemistry tests, coupled with the CMS decision to impose retrospective reporting process that our billing systems could not comply with, raises significant concerns about the integrity of the data from CMS received. Add to this the fact that employers enter negotiated agreements with payers that laboratories are not even privy to, affecting how payers reimburse, and adjudication of some claims take 3 to 6 months due to co-payments, pre-authorization, and deductibles, further creating a challenge to collect accurate final payment rates under the PAMA regulations. NILA is very concerned about the significant errors in the data that CMS plans to utilize to calculate the new fee schedule. Many laboratories reported prorated data or bundled payment amounts as final payments rates because it was impossible for them to extrapolate the data from their billing systems that they worked to manage. CMS final rule implemented PAMA excluding bundle payments from the definition of applicable information. Yet in the face of drastic financial penalties for non-compliance with reporting, laboratories reported what data they recorded in their billing systems. During last year's PAMA advisory panel, the panel made 2 separate recommendations for how the automated chemistry panels or their associated tests might be reported or paid for. Under the first recommendation, the laboratory would report prices for an automated test only when a payer paid for the test separately. CMS would then use the reported rate to set a weighted median for each test based on the data reported. Organ and disease panel rates would be continued to be reported by the laboratories under PAMA and priced as panels. Under the second recommendation, CMS would create a HCPCS code to represent panels of chemistry tests. These codes would then be crosswalked or gap filled. CMS officials stated at the time that under this scenario, it was unlikely rates would be crosswalked to current ATP rates. As the panel further deliberates on this issue, it's important to reflect on what the statute allows and what it does not permit. The PAMA statute requires that the test payment amount be equal to the weighted median, and that is derived from the applicable information reported for each test during a data collection period. Given this fact, the only appropriate recommendation for the pricing of automated tests is based on the test rates on a weighted median under PAMA. With everything that the laboratory just endured to address PAMA and thousands of dollars in lost staff to do so would be burdened on top of further threatening laboratory businesses. NILA advises that the only viable recommendation permitted under statute is the first recommendation to pay for each chemistry test in the CPT codes for organ and disease panels based on weighted median for the CPT code. NILA also advises that before moving forward to revise the fee schedule, CMS and the panel address the substantial exclusion of data from a large segment of the laboratory market, independent hospital outreach laboratories. Due to the construction of the regulation, we believe only a small number of hospitals provided PAMA data through the first reporting process. As a result, the data CMS uses to calculate the weighted median rates under PAMA will be incomplete and skewed, not reflective of the laboratory market, whether that be for automated chemistries or any other test on the fee schedule. In closing, NILA offers the following recommendations. 1, CMS issue an interim final rule that adjusts the PAMA timeline and postpones any calculation and publication of revised payment rates for existing tests. 2, CMS amends the definition of applicable laboratory or identifies for public comment a statistically valid approach to ensure PAMA reported data reflects the full laboratory market, physician, hospital, and independent laboratories. And finally, CMS further amend the PAMA regulation to allow for a transparent validation process for data collected and to appropriately address data integrity concerns. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the panel have any questions for Dr. Smalley? Okay, Dr. Morrison?
Do you think there's a subset of data that was submitted for PAMA evaluation that has value? Do you think there's a pristine set of data that could be used, or do you think it's all as you described?
I don't think that there's any pristine data when you're looking at the retrospective process with the misunderstanding of how payments were done in the marketplace.
Thank you.
Does the panel have any other questions for Dr. Smalley? Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So we're going to do a quick pivot here. We have Dr. Joseph Chin, who is the Deputy Director of the Clinical Assessment Group. We're going to go back to G0499, and I believe we have questions from Vicki, possibly from Michelle, and possibly from Dr. Pratt, I think. So G0499 is the code that was created for their local coverage, national coverage determination for hepatitis assessment in pregnant individuals. So who would like to? Okay, go ahead.
This is Vicki Basowski. The question that I had, and I think was echoed by others on the panel, is whether we could have clarification of what tests are intended to be bundled in this G code to reflect what the coverage analysis group, what the CAG decision memo indicates. So which tests are intended to be done routinely as part of this screening benefit?
And that's a good question. I guess we didn't specify, specifically in that code. So basically, I'm Joseph Chin, the Deputy Director in the Coverage Analysis Group, CMS. So it's not specifically listed in the code. So the code is intended to really identify a high-risk population that's really recommended to have screening, basically based on the task force recommendation. The high risk as a individual that was from a region that had a prevalence of 2% or higher. So the tests are the typical tests that you actually would run for hepatitis C screening, and which would include, I think, the test that there's several CPT codes that look at specifically the types of tests, and it includes the antigen, the surface, and I think the core antigen. So
yeah.
Right. So the specific markers are in the code description. So I think the question perhaps was really the intended population, and I think that's why we were trying to look at a G code for that, to specify that it is a screening service for a high-risk individual, and the high risk being defined in our national decision.
Can I follow up? Then the question still remains. I think we understand the utility of the code with regard to the coverage determination, but which test are you wanting to be included? I know the surface antigen, but is it also to include the surface antibody and the core antibody? I believe the antigen neutralization test would have to be a reflex test only with reactive samples, but are you intending that those 3 tests be done simultaneously as part of a screening algorithm in this patient group?
Right, so we didn't specify that, and it's not noted in the coding, so, and I don't believe it's actually to that granularity. So it's a good comment. I don't know if I can actually, since we actually don't describe it specifically, make any determination about that. I think if that's the question, that really would require a clarification of actually the code itself and in our decision.
So that's where we're getting into a quandary here, because if it's just the screening surface, it would probably be the hepatitis B surface antigen test, and then if that was positive, then the additional codes would be covered as the neutralizing confirmatory test and the antibodies to the core antigen and then the other one. So it would be sequential, so that the G0499 would just crosswalk to the initial test, but then the confirmatory testing would be allowed, or does the G0499 crosswalk to the whole bundle of tests? It's going to make a difference in what the pricing of that code is.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hambrick.
Edith Hambrick, CMS. I think you've done it succinctly, so what I would suggest that the panel do, not that, price it, give a crosswalk for just the initial code, which is what, the surface antigen, is that the initial one? And then give us a price for if all 3 were done, like you're saying, the reflex testing for the other 2, while we sort this out. That way, when we price it, you know. So that's what I would do.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the recommendations are to consider, the panel is to consider creating 2 prices. One, if the screening in and of itself is done, and then another price if it leads to the confirmatory reflex testing. So this would allow the flexibility for us to code the use of this service for the national coverage determination.
Yes. So one just for the surface antigen, and then the second one with the surface antigen and the any HBS core and the core. Yes. And the antibody, correct. That way we can move on. Exactly. They'll give us So which, can you, Vicki, antibody?
87340.
So that one's the only one that crosswalks?
Can you repeat what the recommendation is?
So the recommendation for G0499 is the following. We, okay, it's not a recommendation, it's a suggestion that G0499 be, have two potential payments. One is when the surface antigen is tested for, and a second suggestion would be to price the code when all of the other components of testing for hepatitis B are tested for, i.e. for the neutralizing confirmatory reactive results, antibodies to hepatitis B surface antigen, and antibodies to the hepatitis core antigen.
So it looks like that the initial
So
code,
this is, who is this speaking?
This is Michelle Schumacher, sorry. It looks like the initial code for the hepatitis B surface antigen is 87340.
That would be the initial service. And then if you included the confirmatory codes either as a bundle or as a separate, the second sequence is 87341, which is the neutralizing antibody. 86706 is the surface antibody, and 86704 is the total core antibody. So either all four of those are included together, or you do the 87340, and then if that's positive, then you do the other three as the second sequence. Did that make sense, Vicki,
Yes.
from a micro perspective? I think we're going to have, we can certainly, this is Vicki Basowski, we can certainly put the codes down for those options. We know what codes go with what tests, but then what tests are intended to be included in this coverage determination will have to be clarified by CMS.
Dr. Loy?
Yeah, this feels very unique to me as a panel member, making a crosswalk recommendation and voting on that to go for 2 different clinical scenarios. And I'd just like to get the panel's reaction to the notion of gap filling, full well knowing that at times there will be gap filling for that initial testing only, and there will be other clinical scenarios where there will be initial testing with the confirmatory testing, and then somehow weighting that amount or letting the data tell us what proportion of those go on to confirmatory testing and establishing an amount based on the data coming in as a gap filling. Because otherwise, I feel like I'm trying to crosswalk one code to do different clinical scenarios.
My concern is, I concur with your concern that I think this is, this code descriptor is not appropriately written or described so that we cannot make an adequate decision on this or weigh in an appropriate manner.
This is Edith Hambrick. Would it be possible in view of your comments, Dr. Pratt, would it be possible to give us crosswalk or gap fill recommendations for each component as you see them, and then we can, at least we would have some baseline data to work from?
Right. I think we can make crosswalk decisions based on the initial test and each of the follow-up tests. The question becomes about the bundling of when to bundle, when not to bundle, and bundling them all together is inappropriate. It only should be bundled if the first one is positive, and then you need the reflex test.
Correct.
And I am not an infectious disease expert. I know nothing about infectious disease. So it just seems that it would be, I don't know what percentage of the time or proportionate amount of time that it's positive and that you need that reflex testing. Is it 1%? Is it 99%?
And that's why perhaps, Edith Hambrick, again, if you gave us the components, your potential crosswalks for the components, then we can, I can understand your concern about, is it 10%, that type of thing. So if you could just give us your crosswalk for the components, and if you could make any comments about whether you think that after you do the initial test, there would be just comments, efficiencies when you do the other 2, 3 that are afterwards. If not, don't worry about that part of it. But if, like, for example, if you know that if you do the antibodies to the surface antigen and the core antigen, there's usually some type of 10% different, that type of thing. If you don't know it, don't worry about that. But if you could just give us the potential crosswalks for the components, that would be helpful.
You may actually consider creating 2 different codes, so one for the initial test and then one for the confirmatory bundle.
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Chin, do you have anything to say?
I think I would actually agree with comments and also with what Edith said. So basically, looking at the wording of this, I think it is combining two possible scenarios, and that's probably not the way I think we would have.
Liked it to have reflected the...
Well, I think the screening really is the first, part of that test. So I think that's, good comment. So we'll have to take that into consideration as to really what really to do with that.
Okay. Dr. Loy?
Yes, Dr. Bzelski, could you opine on the incremental work of neutralizing and confirmatory testing relative to the initial surface antibody testing?
This is Vicki Bzelski. I can't give you percentages. That's not actually done in the laboratory that I have responsibility for, so I can't give you a percentage.
Brian Loigan, is there anyone on the panel that can answer that question? Because if what we're really talking about incrementally is a small amount of work in addition to the initial screening testing, then our job's a bit easier. But if we don't know, okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, so let me go back to our multiple suggestions here. It sounds like a few things need to happen. For today's purposes, does the panel agree that at least pricing the component parts is an option? And then to provide comments on bundling it. Can I also ask that you provide comments on the need to split the code and to create a second code? Okay, so three things. So the first one is the crosswalk. So we had one presenter who provided the following codes to be priced: 87340, 87341, 86706, 86704, and these correspond to the components of the current code. So that would be your recommendation for individual crosswalks for the components of the current code. The second request on your ballots is to give your comments on bundling, and the third is to provide your comments on the necessity of creating a potential second code to separate the two scenarios. Is this what the panel would like to vote on? Okay, so I see a few head nods. I'm assuming everybody's good to go. So please submit your ballot for code G0499. While you are doing that, can I ask Joyce Gresko of ACLA to come to the podium to present for the next ATP comments and presentations? All right. Okay, so can we, okay, so the ballots are ready? Okay, great. Thanks, Glenn. Vicki, do you have any other comments? Because your card is up.
Oh, I just keep forgetting to put it down.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just want to make sure everybody is. All right, so Ms. Gresko, go ahead. And okay, so I'm going to stop you at 5 after, if that's all right. Thanks.
Okay. My name is Joyce Gresko. I'm with the law firm Alston & Bird, and we represent the American Clinical Laboratory Association. And ACLA, as you may know, is the leading trade association that represents national, regional, and local labs, many of whom perform these AMCC tests every day for Medicare beneficiaries. Their member companies have a direct stake in ensuring that prices for these tests are developed openly and fairly. ACLA submitted a statement last year in response to the panel's recommendations, and also had written a letter to CMS about these codes previously. So in the July 19th, 2016 report, the panel had 3 different options to deal with payment for these tests. And we continue to believe that the current text of the statute allows only the first option that was up on the screen, a little bit earlier, which is paying for the individual tests and the organ and disease panels based on the private payer data for each CPT code that's been reported by laboratories, which is required for all other tests under PAMA as well. So PAMA's text currently doesn't give CMS the authority to implement either of the remaining two options that were put forward. Without going into too much background here, but as you know, labs finished reporting their private payer rates and associated volumes for tests on the CLFS just about 2 months ago. And the text of the statute specifies that for a test that's furnished on or after January 1st, 2017, then through regulations changed to 2018, the Medicare payment amount is to be the weighted median of the private payer rates that are reported. There isn't a requirement in the statute that CMS must receive a certain amount of data in order to calculate a weighted median. When it receives information about private payer rates and associated volumes for a test on the CLFS, it's required to develop a weighted median for the test based on the information that it received. As you heard the previous speaker mention, private payers do use a variety of approaches for reimbursing laboratories for the AMCC tests. Some pay for each test individually and then identify the payment rate on the remittance advice, and others use approaches that are similar to Medicare's approach. In some cases, when a private payer's payment varies based on the number of tests that are performed, the payer identifies a specific payment amount for each test on a remittance advice, but the rate may change from claim to claim based on the number of tests ordered and performed. CMS instructed labs not to report private payer rates that aren't identifiable at the individual code level. Thus, where a laboratory could not correlate a private payer payment amount to a specific CPT code, it was not to report anything about the payment. And then also, the agency instructed labs that where a private payer groups test level payments into a claim level payment instead of by individual code, the claim level payment was not to be reported. So the options that were presented up there on the screen, our position is that the only one of these options that's permissible under the statute currently is the first one. The statute says the payment amount shall be equal to the weighted median derived from the information reported for each test. And then elsewhere in the statute, it says that CMS shall calculate a weighted median for each lab test with respect to which information is reported for the data collection period. And this is regardless of how much data is reported for a particular test or from how many laboratories. And it's also regardless of whether a price is going to go up or down. So I would suggest that the con in the first line there really is not relevant, that the cost could increase to Medicare. That's just not part of what's in the statute. CMS can't implement the second option, which is paying only for a certain number of AMCC tests on a claim, because CMS would be paying the correct weighted median amount for certain tests, but nothing at all for other tests, beyond a predetermined number of tests. This isn't permitted under the statute, and there's not a cutoff contemplated anywhere in Section 216 of PAMA. So I would also suggest that one of the cons in the second and third lines on the screen ought to be that those are not permissible under the law as it stands right now. The third option, under which CMS would create a bundling system and create new codes that are akin to the current ATP codes, would result in prices for the bundles that don't reflect the weighted medians for the individual CPT codes included in each bundle. Yet the statute requires CMS to pay for a test based on the weighted median of the private payer rates that were reported about the test, and it doesn't authorize CMS to create bundled payments for lab tests paid under the CLFS. If a lab bills the CPT code for the test, then under the terms of the statute, CMS must pay the weighted median for that code. It would be problematic if CMS were to create new HCPCS codes and require labs to bill those codes rather than CPT codes, First, such an approach would be a circumvention of the purpose and intent of the statute, which is to establish rates at market prices. But also, as indicated on the screen, CMS wouldn't know what specific tests had been ordered and performed, which is an approach that CMS previously rejected years ago. And also noted on the screen, such a change would require significant and costly changes to billing software and programming. It also would set a dangerous precedent that if CMS didn't like one of the results of any of the data that's submitted to it under PAMA, it could basically just decide not to use the data and go a different way. So in sum, the only one of the three options the panel put forth that we think is permissible is the first one, which is paying for each test based on the weighted median of private payer rates for the corresponding CPT code. Thanks for the opportunity to share ACLA's views with you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you and CMS and other stakeholders to come up with a solution for this issue. Thank you.
Just want to provide the voting results for G0499. 1 recommendation to gap fill. 6 individuals recommended for an initial code of 87340. And if this is positive, then follow-up codes of 87341, 86706, 86704. 2 recommendations for 86706, 87340, 87341, and 86704, and 1 recommendation for 87340.
Okay, so does the panel have any comments or recommendations? Okay. So I would ask that you keep it brief.
Yeah, no, this is Gail Marcus. I had a question for the last speaker, which is, given that payers are bundling payments for lab tests, how would you, so in a lot of cases, you don't get the individual lab price. And all payers are bundling very differently.
So can ACLA keep that very brief? I'm sorry, because we are supposed to have stopped at noon, so.
Yep. Okay. My answer to that would be that it is true that many payers bundle the payments for these tests, but not all payers do. And CMS presumably, although we haven't seen the data yet, the public hasn't, CMS presumably got some data for individually paid tests by private payers. And under the statute, it's to use what data it's got reported for those tests. The bundled payments wouldn't have been reported under the instructions that CMS gave to labs.
Thank you. Okay, this is the last question.
Well, I was going to make a recommendation, or actually ask if we could make a recommendation. Could this be something that could go back to the subgroup so that we could have some follow-up discussion?
Yes,
based
that was
on
actually going
if
to
we had
be,
any new
yes,
experiences over the past year?
because of the time limit that we've been given, I was going to ask the panel if they would like to reconvene the subcommittee, come up with their recommendations, and have it posted on the web. Okay.
And could we ask that the speakers could submit your written comments if you haven't already? I didn't see any.
Sure thing.
Thank you. All right, so this concludes the meeting for today and for this year. And I just want to thank the panel members. This cohort will be, some of them will be retiring, and I just want to thank them for their 3 years of service.
Whether you like it.